It's so great. We have such a camaraderie built up already. For those, how many of you, by the way, were unable to join us yesterday? Just so I have a sense. Okay. Well, not such a great number that I don't have to feel too guilty about not giving you a long introduction. You suffered through that yesterday if you were with us. But first, before I do anything, I want to say special thanks to Savannah Kustra, who just joined Parsons, who's been invaluable in helping me with the logistics of this program, to Rebecca Nisson, who's not here, who also worked with her, and to all my students who you met when you came in, who have name tags on. They have been absolutely invaluable with Rebecca and Savannah in making sure I don't trip myself up. So thank you all. And thank you all for coming. For those of you that were here, I imagine it seems a little unfair to be trapped inside after walking through the city with Philip last night, especially since it's practically summer outside. I mean, it's shirt sleeve weather for New Yorkers, but I think if yesterday's talk by Peter Hall was any indication of what's to come, there's no place I'd rather be than hearing the conversations we're going to have today. And Peter gave a real tour de force portrait of another approach to history. I'm going to paraphrase what he just told me. He was putting design in history. He talked about a relational notion of history, that if we think of the world and the things that we live with, if we think about more than just the usual parameters of our usual narratives, we'll come up with other stories that may be, in some cases, rather alarming. You know, the story of air conditioning was absolutely one of them. But I'm not going to rehash what Peter said, other than to thank him for doing a fantastic job. And to my definition of, or how I talk about history with my students and prospective students, I said, you know, we're not interested in history as a bracket, 1925 to 1945. We're interested in how history bleeds into the future, because it does. And I expect Peter's talk will. So what I'd like to do, just to set this up, for those of you who couldn't come, is to introduce just briefly the four panels we're going to have today. The first one has to do with narratives of design and gender, and we are lucky to have Liz Collins and Jenny Sabin with us, and not one but two moderators, Elizabeth Guffey and Hazel Clark, my colleague at Parsons. One quote that I showed last night, a little food for thought, comes from Bruno Latour. Peter was very useful in interpreting the actor network theory as a possible mode of studying design vis-a-vis history through networks. And I like Latour's co-option, which is becoming more and more popular, or co-optation of ties, lacing, weaving, and twisting towards strength. Now, clearly, this could be viewed in many, many contexts, but given who's going to be speaking and what they're going to be speaking about, positioning what's generally gendered a feminine practice, which is knitting, weaving, twisting, lacing, in the context of strength is, I think, wonderful. Next, we'll have a panel on the idea of agency. And here we'll have Sean Donahue from LA, Laura Pennon here from Parsons, and Elżbieta Matynia from the New School for Social Research. And here I'm a little schizophrenic in my choice of voices and narratives. One favors the idea that objects make the world sentient, and that objects are projections of we who make them, and they have a reciprocal effect in the world. The other, by Nishat Anwan, says that the agent is the one, and here the one, I believe, is a person who affects change through the empowerment of others, allowing them to engage in their environments in a ways previously unknown. So it may be parochial, it may be a sign of my generational status, but I'm interested, do things have agency? Do people have agency? Where's the mutuality? So hopefully we'll discuss that. And then I'm going to stop here, because if I start talking about what we'll do this afternoon, you'll just forget it anyway. And I'm taking time away. I'm taking time away from the folks coming. I'm going to briefly introduce Elizabeth and Hazel. Elizabeth is a professor of art and design history at SUNY Purchase. She's the founding editor of the Journal of Design and Culture, which we hope may bear some of our fruits from the symposium in the future. She's written extensively. She's the author of Retro, The Culture of Revival, Her most recent book, Poster and Material History, examines graphic design within a new materialist framework, and her current research, appropriate enough, examines the place of women and gender in the history of information and communication design. Hazel, who will join the group later for the discussion, is a colleague of mine since basically she hired me in 2005. Where are you, Hazel? Right there. She's now research chair of fashion at Parsons, the New School for Design, our full title, where she teaches in fashion studies and in design studies. She's a historian and theorist who specializes in fashion, textiles, and design studies. Her books include The Fabric of Cultures, Fashion, Identity, and Globalization, and as every student of mine knows, because they get a copy on admission, the Design Studies Reader, and Fashion in Everyday Life, Britain and America, 1890 to 2010. With that very superficial introduction, I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth now. And actually, yeah, that's fine.
Well, first, let me thank Susan for organizing this event and New School's Design Studies program for providing us with an opportunity to hear such a provocative series of presentations. I am especially glad to speak today, but I also want to draw your attention to the fact that today is International Women's Day. And indeed, more pointedly, I'm also going to add that as we speak, delegates from all over the world are gathering just a few blocks from here at the UN, and there they are organizing under the theme, Equality for Women is Progress for All. The representatives there will themselves be introducing a series of narratives, and they all have a pressing coherence to them, including gender equality, as well as changing notions of masculinity, the education of girls, abolition of sexual trafficking, and other key issues. The UN initiative is a forum that's been taking place for the last 50 years. But I want to highlight something interesting and new that has started to emerge this year within that context, which is that these people are gathering officially, and there's also a bunch of NGOs, so unofficially as well. But they're being linked together by new and potentially quite powerful platforms. This is a change going on here, and it's very palpable as you start to speak with individuals who are active in these communities. Their organizing features have been social media driven, with networking that was unheard of 50 years ago or even 5 years ago. And indeed, they communicate through ongoing conversations, live tweeting, they've been providing webcasts, Instagram feeds, Google Meetups. They are slowly starting to show a remarkable solidarity and come together with a new and pressing urgency. I mentioned this as evidence of an emerging narrative in design studies, what's broadly being dubbed a fourth wave of feminism. The latter is not restricted to a single story by any means. Indeed, on the one hand, we see it in digital gatherings like the storming Wikipedia edit-a-thons, or else these sorts of self-organized meetups and classes that are taking place. On the other hand, we can also see its characteristics more broadly reflected in the actions and practices of makers like Liz Collins and Jenny Sabin, the two speakers who we're lucky to have here today. You may have noticed that I've been using words, and I think Susan also, using words like coming together, weaving, and Susan has mentioned networks as well, as a way to describe the emerging pattern called fourth wave feminism. And indeed, this is one of the key characteristics of this growing movement. It may reflect the digital networks that are being used to discuss gender equality. New technologies can bring together and connect. We all know that already. But these narratives, as they start coming together, and they're about weaving disparate parts together. So it's clear that this is not just an innovative practice, as well as the practices of our speakers, but it provides a metaphor for the kind of work and expectations for that work that we bring to the table, too. Liz Collins is a New York City-based designer and artist, recognized, celebrated internationally for her use of machine knitting to create groundbreaking clothing, textiles, performances, and installations. Collins is a graduate of RISD. She was an associate professor there until 2013. She's a United States Artist Target Fellow, a member of the Council of Fashion Designers of America, and has exhibited works and done performances at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City, at the ICA in Boston, the Tang Museum, the Museum of Modern Art. Jenny Sabin is an architectural designer, artist, and educator. Her work has been at the forefront of a new direction for 21st century architectural practice, one that investigates the intersections of architecture, technology, and science. Jenny is a principal of Jenny Sabin Studio, an experimental design practice based in Philadelphia, and she's director of the Sabin Design Group, or Lab, at Cornell AAP. She has co-authored Meander, Variegating Architecture with Ferda Colleton. She is also working on Lab Book, a monograph highlighting intersections between architecture and science and the work of Lab Studio. We will be hearing from each speaker shortly, and then we're going to turn to Hazel Clark, who's been mentioned already, professor of the MA program in Fashion Studies, and research chair of fashion at Parsons, the New School of Design. Dr. Clark will kick off the discussion with some questions, but we're very much looking forward to opening up then and having a more general discussion of a series of provocative themes. So first, please join me in welcoming Jenny Sabin, our first speaker.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. Thank you to Susan for the invitation. And of course, thanks to the New School, Parsons, for hosting this important symposium. Okay, so this morning I will address the subject of our panel through the lens of my transdisciplinary collaborations, with an interest in developing an alternative and perhaps a new material practice in architecture, through the generative fabrication of the nonlinearities of material and form across disciplines. I'm going to start by discussing some of the foundational work and points of inspiration and departure, and then I'll talk about one project in depth and two, perhaps one, we'll see how I'm doing on time, very briefly. So to be sure, biology presents useful conceptual models for architects to consider, where form is in constant adaptation with environmental events. Here, geometry and matter is an active elastic ground, a datascape that steers and specifies form, function, and structure in context. Ultimately, I'm interested in mining the gap that exists between computational design thinking and material manifestation as a conceptual space. It is an approach that may be referred to as what I'm calling matrix architecture, a hybrid term that bridges my collaborative work with matrix biologists, material scientists, mechanical engineers, and physicists with shared relationships between architecture and crafts-based media, namely textiles and ceramics. Matrix architecture embodies code and context. It is the embedding of material systems with biological relationships and behavior to generate models that are at once natural and artificial and engage geometry and matter as an active ground. Now, just a little bit of background as to how I got started with some of this work. I was fortunate to be at Penn as a visiting lecturer for 6 years during a very special time, and I don't think we quite knew just how special it was under the chairmanship of the late Detlef Mertens. And it was during that time that we started a group called the Nonlinear Systems Organization, where I was a senior researcher and director of research. And these are some of the key figures that were a part of that group. And although we were bringing important scientists and thinkers across disciplines to the table, I began to become a little bit skeptical as to the fact that we weren't actually engaging collaboration across disciplines. And it was in that context that I started Lab Studio with Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones, where we paired graduate architecture students with postdocs and fellows in the context of the lab setting. And I'll come back to this in a moment. This is a photograph taken on the first day of a course that Peter and I taught in the graduate architecture program titled Nonlinear Systems Biology and Design. I also was a part of a group and continuing to play an important role in called the International Smart Geometry Group. And initially, the project was a piece of software, one of the first parametric software programs called Generative Components. It made MicroStation and Bentley hip for the first time. And beyond the software, it really was about bringing together a group of researchers, architects, engineers, who all together had a very embedded and wedded interest in pushing forward a way of thinking relationally and systemically in design. Fortunately, we have a few more women involved with this group now. I'm here in the corner. And there's some key figures around this table in the context of computational design that are doing really interesting work now today. So in contrast to the current gender landscape of computational designers in contemporary architecture practice and research, it was women who generated the first examples of parametrically designed and computationally fabricated form in modern architecture. The coupling together of architecture and textiles is not a new idea by any means. Modern and historical examples that come to mind include the seminal and vast bodies of artistic and design work by Annie Albers, Günter Stolz, and Lily Reich. Importantly, the Bauhaus weavers marked a shift from expressionistic and individual handcraft compositions to mass-produced and rapid manufactured prototypes for furniture, interior design, and architectural elements. This shift led the way to a new approach to craft and making, one that was marked by the integration of pattern, material constraints, form, and fabrication, perhaps offering up the first analog examples of generative and parametric design work in the context of scaled prototyping and fabrication. The women in the weaving workshop at Dessau embraced the capabilities of the most current mechanized looms of the day and integrated this with a mathematical understanding of pattern and form generation. And I'll just add that they also kept the school afloat financially for many years. The pliable plane was Annie Albers' term for this generative intersection between architecture and textiles. This pliable plane is a landscape of information made tangible through geometry and matter. The technological and cultural history of weaving offers architecture a potent and useful relationship between design and digital fabrication. We could say that the mechanized textile processes that the women of the weaving workshop employed, especially weaving and knitting, are the first examples of 3D printing. Now, as with one of my recent projects titled My Thread Pavilion, which I'll come back to, seen in some of these images here, which was a commission from Nike, and Body Blanket, as well as Foyer Tapestry, my work diversifies into linkages between computation and the binary natures of weaving and knitting that influence parallel innovations, including digital space and the contemporary computer. Body Blanket, this is an image of Body Blanket, which I produced in 2005, and Foyer Tapestry, produced in 2006, based on the Foyer series, a binary mathematical sequence for the analysis of sound, are woven in wool using an early computational model for computers, as many of you know, the Jacquard loom. As one traces the technological and cultural history of weaving, a link is revealed between the punch card technologies used to automate the Jacquard looms of the mechanical age and the early binary systems used for computation in the very first mainframe computers. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the sort of legacy of one of the first computer programmers, Ada Lovelace, who is responsible for forming a link between the punch cards and the first steam-driven calculation device invented by Babbage. This link is rooted in the coded binary patterning system of warp and weft. Now, because weaving exists within the space of 0 and 1, it is possible to weave computational designs that are rooted in a binary structure of data points. Both Foyer Tapestry, seen here, which was originally on view in 2006 at Artispace as a part of the Hedge exhibition, and Body Blanket were generated from mathematical models that transfer sound, color, harmonic systems, and dynamic data from the human body, and this diagram describes the design process for Body Blanket, into woven designs. The woven data is transformed into a CAD file of binary block code, which is then fed into a digitized Jacquard loom. This process seeks to understand and intuit spatial patterns within data sets, patterns that through study and analysis lead to architectural elements in the form of textile tectonics. The process gives rise to questions about the visualization of data, technology, and how we as people interface and intersect with information. Now, to be sure, this dynamic space is also biological. A seminal reference for my work is the biological extracellular matrix, which Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones, as a matrix biologist, introduced to me early on in 2005 and 2006. It's a dynamic protein network that physically and chemically couples the exterior environment of cells with their interior and vice versa. It's an architectural textile of sorts. In discerning which effects and materials are actually scalable, my practice and research operates across 3 distinct phases. The first includes the production of new tools and methodologies for modeling complex biological behavior. The second entails architectural prototyping at the human scale, and the third operates at the scale of ecological building design. Now, this immersion within transdisciplinary work found at the interface between architecture, computation, and science has been substantially bolstered by my collaborative research with scientists, namely Peter early on, Dr. Peter Lloyd-Jones, who's a former professor of pathology and lab medicine based at the Institute for Medicine and Engineering at Penn, and now with Dr. Xu Yang, who's a material scientist also based at Penn, who engages biomimicry. Now, within the context of our collaboration, we co-founded, as I mentioned, Lab Studio, which has now matured into my own lab at Cornell and is an active network with original members of Lab Studio now based at Jefferson, Stanford, and Cornell. And initially, Peter and I were primarily interested in architectural models and design tools that come forth through the study of cells and tissues within tissue-specific dynamic extracellular matrix environments. More specifically, we were interested in observing how microenvironmental architectures at the level of the matrix, how they control cell behavior, and how function follows form at the geometric, biochemical, and biophysical levels. This matrix environment is a cell-derived woven and globular protein network that contacts most cells within the body. As I mentioned, it's an architectural textile of sorts. And importantly, as I've come to learn from my collaboration with the Jones Laboratory, this environment changes dynamically throughout development and disease. And we are specifically interested in models that show how these alterations feed back to control cell and tissue behavior at the level of code and beyond in multiple dimensions, including time. Now, in one early project, which may be familiar to some of you, we developed advanced imaging and scripting procedures to model networking behavior of cells. This project, titled Branching Morphogenesis, which was composed of 75,000 cable zip ties, investigates part-to-whole relationships revealed during the generation of branch structures formed in real time by interacting lung endothelial cells. The study and quantification of this network allows for greater understanding of how variable components might give rise to structured networks in both biology and architecture. The installation overall materializes 5 slices in time that capture the predicted force network exerted by interacting cells upon their neighboring matrix environment. And I'm not going to talk too much about this project in depth, but wanted to give a brief overview. So I'm going to move into one project that I want to talk about in depth. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Great. Which is titled eSkin, Multiscalar Design Ecologies. And we were fortunate in 2010 to be granted one of 10 $2 million grants from the NSF Foundation. And it really had a lot to do with the fact that we had Lab Studio up and running. We had been engaged in transdisciplinary research for upwards 4 years at that point. And it was the first time that the NSF actually put out a call for collaborative teams that would include architects. And the primary mission was basically to rethink the whole problem of sustainability and our approach to it. This is the team, which includes material scientists, myself and my team, cell biologists, as well as mechanical and systems engineers. And the The crux of the proposal in terms of our launch point was to mine this fine-scale design ecology, this dynamic reciprocity between environment and code, again referencing the extracellular matrix. And what we posited was that by observing, modeling, visualizing this fine-scale design ecology, that we might, in the end, be able to produce passively responding thin film technology to exist with to integrate with existing building construction or new facade design. So specifically, we're seeking to explore materiality from nano to macro scales based upon a quantitative understanding of nonlinear and dynamic cell behaviors on geometric substrates. No, we're not positing that we'll have human cells on buildings, but the cells are sort of stand-in at a nano and micro scale to eventually develop sensors and imagers that are locally dumb but can learn over time against environmental cues and events. Our role involves generating tools to visualize and simulate cell attraction forces and cell behavior based upon proximity to various constraints, such as forces distributed via an extracellular matrix environment over multiple time states, while also incorporating material constraints coming forward from results stemming from Dr. Xu Yang's lab, who's the material scientist on the team, such as constraints of pillar spacing for macro scale study. We also help design, simulate, and generate multiple patterns and geometries to test at the material level. And beyond the role of visualization, probably most importantly, we also direct the architectural intent of the project by constantly speculating as to how results at the nano and micro level will potentially look, feel, and assemble at a building scale. And the schematic conceptual diagram outlines 3 levels of layered interactive response, including sensing, signaling, and responsive elements, as well as showing that in an architectural facade assembly. So obviously central to the project and our original proposal is the reduction of the overall carbon footprint in our built environment, while also addressing important social and community-based topics that arise through large-scale transformations of building facades against environmental constraints. So we're not only interested in the obviously the functional aspects of eSkin, but we're also very interested in this notion of a personalized architecture, how human inputs and parameters can integrate from nano to macro scales. The insights from understanding how cells modify their underlying substrates will lead to the rational design and engineering of passively responding materials and integrated smart sensors and optical electrical circuits. We're interested in parameters such as proximity, obviously engaging solar heat gain, even haptic qualities such as touch. Lately, we've been looking at how context, occupancy, and environmental factors become stimuli for change. So not yet modeling buildings, but looking at hypothetical sites and solar inputs and how changes in geometry and componentry influence those parameters. These speculative renderings are looking at generic to specific approaches, emphasizing the importance of a self-evolving passive material system capable of efficiently relocating its own resources temporarily based on shifts within the environment. And then in the last year, we've spent, this is actually the 4th and final year of this NSF grant. We were fortunate to get a new NSF grant to continue some of this work in a different context. We've been developing a series of simulations and prototypes, again, speculating as to what the eSkin might be at a building scale, because honestly, the reality is a sample of the eSkin is 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So we have a bit more work to do in terms of enabling this to become an industry-ready product in the built environment. And these are some images of some of those prototypes. This is currently on view as a part of the 9th Archilab exhibition at the Frock in Orléans. The exhibition title is Naturalizing Architecture. And we're just working with one parameter, changes in color, which was actually a big deal. This took 1.5 years to produce, involving everyone on the team. And just a little bit of background, what you see here, there's an array of sensors, and when those sensors regionally detect a shift in light intensity, they then in turn pass an electric charge across that material substrate and change the packing behavior of those nanocolloidal particles, which then in turn changes the color. And then just one of our additional prototypes, another simulation, which is working with actual optical data from some of the material substrates. Again, looking at changes in color, and although this is a simulation, it also is including human input through differencing algorithms. So it's going to show a few people interacting. You'll see someone come up from behind. And this is currently a part of an exhibition at Cornell where I have a number of projects. And this is a large-scale projection. So I think I only have time to briefly talk about one other project. But again, just to emphasize the importance of our role as architects to speculate as to what these dynamic conditions might be at an architectural scale. Engaging that third phase that I mentioned in terms of moving some of the architectural prototypes into notions of building ecology and the built environment. And I'll just briefly talk about one project that engages architectural prototyping, that sort of second phase of the work, moving some of the tools and methodologies that we develop into the realm of material and making. And I'll talk about the MyThread Pavilion, which was a commission from Nike that came in 2012 that was a part of a new technology that they had developed, which is essentially knitting shoes. And they invited 6 innovators from around the globe, artists, designers, architects, to essentially riff on the technology and bring some of the core benefits back into our own fields. And out of the 6, I was the only one that actually wanted to work with knitting, and I think they were a bit surprised by that. But I was interested in forming a bridge between the complexity of the human body, dynamic data sets coming from the human body, biodata, which obviously has links to earlier work, and how that would be integrated with the simplicity of knitting. And while I did know a lot about weaving, I realized that I didn't know a whole lot about knitting. And so when the project started, I engaged a collaboration with Anne Emling, who at the time was based at RISD, and we did a series of workshops. We spent a weekend producing a series of prototypes so that I could understand which parameters I could actually work with and which ones potentially could be scaled to an architectural scale. Looking at issues of transparency, we worked with mechanical knitting machines as well as digital knitting interfaces, and also became a part of one of the workshops that I organized. There were 2 workshops leading up to the final pavilion project. One was based on producing data, where we outfitted 30 participants with sensors, collected data, and the second workshop was based on making sense of that data. And so we had a series of material investigations as well as digital investigations. Without going in too much depth, I was interested in the potential to extend these biodata constructs through multiple material scenarios. So I worked with high-tech yarns, photoluminescent yarns, solar active yarns, as well as reflective yarns. And after the workshops, we took all of that information and the data sets especially and began to look at various assemblies, looking at how that data could be filtered and visualized through digital means, through digital knitting, and then finally how that could then interface knitting production, which I was a little naive in terms of thinking that it would be easy to find a collaborator to produce these. But in the end, I ended up working with Shimashiki, which was absolutely perfect because they're at the cutting edge of what's called whole garment knitting. So imagine seamless 3D knitted forms. And I think I'm running out of time, so I'll just go through this very quickly, highlighting some of the geometric components, drawings, highlighting the data sets, this kind of DNA that then actually literally interface with the digital interfaces of the Shimashiki machines, some of the initial prototypes. The external frame, I was interested in this kind of transition between a harder outer edge, series of aluminum laser cut rings held in tension, with an inner sort of soft organic form. This was the seam diagram. This is what the fabric looked like originally. One of the best parts about the project is that it fits into a single canvas bag, weighs about 150 pounds. And so we slowly brought this into tension. There was a whole series of digital and analog simulations to test how this would work. Each cone had its own home, and then as we brought it into tension, at the base there was a taut elliptical ring that formed, and that is what people were able to inhabit. And there were 2 doors on the exterior here. Here you can see some of the photoluminescent threads activated, and then some final shots. So I'm not going to talk about the other project, but I'll just conclude with the following. By immersing oneself in complex woven and biological design problems and abstracting the inherent relationships of these models into code-driven parametric and associative models, it's possible to gain new insights into how mathematics and nature deal with design issues that feature part-to-whole relationships, complexity, and emergent behavior. As the women of the weaving workshop at the Bauhaus pioneered, and certainly in the context of my collaborative work, collaborative pursuits expose us to new modes of thinking and making within a deeper understanding of form and function in context. This type of immersion is paramount as we continue to navigate, occupy, and filter the vast terrain of computational design with increased urgency, criticality, specificity, and sensitivity. Thank you.
Hi, that is me, Liz Collins. First, I'd like to thank Hazel Clark and Susan Yelovich, am I saying your last name properly, for inviting me here. This is great. And as someone who's been participating in academia for years, but now on a somewhat of a hiatus, I'm appreciating being in this discourse during what I'm calling my sabbatical, young retirement, temporary retirement time. So it's nice to be part of this conversation with all you designers, students, and thinkers, and writers, and makers. So I'm interested in this topic of gender. We're in this thread of gender, and I loved hearing from you, Jenny, about your work and being reminded about Annie Albers and the systems and science and technology, because I feel like I come to those places, but they're like kind of hidden in me, or they have turned into intuitive parts of me that I identify with emotion, which can be a very feminine thing. And I think about my father, like your talk made me think about my father. He was an engineer. And when I was very young, I wanted to be an architect. And my grandmother wanted to be an architect. And, you know, so for a long time as an artist and a maker of things, which has been my whole life, I thought about structure and space. And it's really interesting that through years and years of working in fashion and textiles, I've slowly come back to that place where I was when I was very young, where I'm interested in architecture and space. So through the next 20 minutes, I'll talk to you about my work and the evolution of my work through the lens of gender and my own gender identity and my relationship to gender. Just to read briefly a statement about my work. As an artist designer who emerged from fashion and textiles, I follow inquiries that have surfaced from my maker self: material investigations, labor, manufacturing, movement, endurance, and scale. I create textiles, clothing, and installations, often with a performance component and a range of other 2 and 3D work. In my cross-disciplinary creative practice, I'm in a rapidly evolving, shape-shifting phase. My relationship to the body as a site has shifted into a more significant engagement with physical space, particularly architectural space, as an active dialogue between my body, material, color, and mass in relation to air and light. So for this talk, I thought it would be interesting to just go back to the beginning of my young adult engagement with fashion post-graduates or post-college. This is in between undergrad and graduate school. And I went to RISD for both degrees and studied textiles and then textiles and fashion. My first degree, I did a lot with weaving. I was totally obsessed with weaving and was on a track to becoming like a professional weave designer. But as I worked in the world of weaving and I was trying to work in fashion, I found that weaving wasn't really giving me what I wanted because I wanted to connect directly with the body. And knitting for me was, I discovered that it was something so immediate and so connected to the body in terms of the way that fabric could relate to the form. So you can see here on the left, these are hand knitted dresses, and this was from like circa 1995 before I learned to use knitting machines. And on the right is a woven shawl. I found in knitting that I could deal with the whole three-dimensional form of the body concurrent with the making of the fabric. So for me, it really hit this place in myself that was very rewarding, where I could, because I'm also all about efficiency, and I always have been, and I attribute some of that to my engineer father, Navy man, and getting everything done. And I wanted a process that efficiently tackled the making of clothing and the making of fabric, because both were so exciting to me. So how could I do that? And also it was a pragmatic reality about making money. Weaving, if I want to hand weave, it's going to take forever to make things to sell. If I want to knit with a knitting machine, I can make something fairly quickly and be able to turn that into a product. So it was very practical. So the pictures here are these are all hand knit garments. These came after my weaving and before my knitting, and then we quickly move into the machine knit. Back to the idea of gender, because I want to really talk about that in depth. I could talk about a lot of different aspects of my work, but because this is, what we're talking about here in this thread, I'd like to really look at my work in this way, because people ask me a lot, since I'm an out lesbian, queer artist and designer, they ask me, what about your work is queer? And, so I'm thinking about this. I was asked the other day by Todd Oldham. I did a talk at the Leslie Lohman Museum. That I have a piece in a show there right now that I'll show you later. But, what about my work is queer? What about my work is about gender? And so I think it's important to look back, what was I doing here? What was my relationship to myself? What was my relationship to women? What was my relationship to men, to gender, to sexuality? And for me, knits were really sexy. Knits, like I was saying, with the knit, the knit surface being something that engages directly with the body. I found this way to be a second skin, to make a second skin. And so you see in a lot of this work, it's very form-fitting. And I was very interested in my material touching mine or someone else's body. And I think there are interesting things in that about intimacy. Through my clothing, I was trying to communicate with other people and engage with other people in a very intimate way, being intimate with strangers in some way. If I make a sweater and you wear it, and you have a special experience wearing this sweater, which a lot of the clothes helped people do because they were so different. They were attention-getting. They had holes in weird places. Little elastic appendages. They made people feel like creatures. So it's what kind of experience are you having? And I'm creating that for you, so I'm having a relationship with you. And so the level of emotion and intimacy in my work, I think, was high from the beginning. And it's in this work that I did in my early years in fashion, engineering things on the knitting machine, so they were what's called fully fashioned. Jenny already referenced that in the whole garment. Now we have technology that does that. but it does require a high level of programming. Like, it's very complicated, and you need, very knowledgeable engineers to create those programs within the technical interface. And this was my way that was kind of spawned by looking at Issey Miyake's APOC collection, which came out around the time I was in graduate school, and it just blew my mind, like this idea that the fabric and form could be created as one, and the seams were already built into the fabric. So I developed this way to kind of mimic that, constructing these garments that where you see those scalloped seams, like I would make one panel and then attach the other panel to it while I was making it. So by the end of the knitting, the garment was done. So it was like my handmade whole garment kind of approach to knitting. And so anyway, this kind of intimacy was there from the beginning, and a lot of form-fitting clothing and a lot of like transformative way of dressing. And at this time, I was really coming out through my work. So coming out as a queer person. It was in grad school while I was doing, I'm just gonna go back for a second to this early work. Like, these were pieces I was making while I was starting to have my first relationship with a woman. So it was a big deal for me because I developed this kind of way in my thesis to talk about my emotions, my emotional landscape, my pain, my relationship to sexuality, to joy, to every kind of emotional experience in this visceral way through the clothing. And I started to see it as like a kind of self-surgery. And so through this transformation of my identity as from a hetero straight person to, in hindsight, I was always queer somehow, but, to someone who was shifting into a very different way of relating to my love interests, and who were they? It was a big deal. So I think through this early work, my relationship to gender was very present, and kind of sometimes overly feminizing things or aggressive, like there was a kind of what some writers called an aggressive femininity to my work, a real stance of like this tough, super sexy woman who owned the room. And, at that time I really was hoping that celebrities would wear my clothes. I didn't have a target audience of, mid-market or the everyday person on the street or any of like what you all would be wearing today. I wanted show-stopping garments that would be worn by performers. Like Bjork was big at the time. I mean, she still is. She'll always be a fashion forerunner. But I just really wanted these clothes to be on people who wanted to own the room, who wanted attention, who wanted to feel sexy, who wanted to transform in some way. Like Lil' Kim, who at that time was very much one of those people. So, you see here, like it was like for me wearing my heart on my sleeve, the outside on the inside, or the inside on the outside. I'm kind of dyslexic sometimes. So, the self-surgery was there, like the guts, the veins, the blood, the gore, but also like these natural things. Like I was making a lot of connections between anatomy and nature. And really grounding my work and my ideas in the natural world, but also in things like tension, bondage and release, pressure, discomfort, pleasure, ambivalence about the commodification of the female body, concealing and revealing, contradiction. So, it was a really exciting time for me in terms of like finding my own identity to gender and who I was as an artist and a designer and a queer person, I think. This piece on the right, Simon Doonan reviewed it in The Observer, and he said that it was like, or the whole collection was like a 70s feminist art collective. And for me, that was really exciting to have my work cited as being connected to that continuum, that legacy, because I felt very connected to it, to Judy Chicago, to you know, to the womb room, to all of the feminist stuff from the 70s, which is when I was, you know, a kid, and reading our bodies ourselves, you know, and learning about who I was as a young person in the 70s. So, you know, the exploration of different kinds of femininity continued through the years, and with all kinds of other aspects of references and ideas, antiquity, and again, anatomy. It's, you know, a lot of the themes have carried through that will always be present in my work. But I think this was an interesting and pivotal moment where it started to get a little more butch. Yeah, so the butch thing started to happen, and then like weird warped versions of femininity, like the geisha, and you know, things started moving in weird ways for me and getting wilder and kind of rougher and more like absurd, you know, and I think working in the fashion industry, I started feeling like things got kind of more absurd for me, and I wanted to push that and play with scale and play with fetish and, you know, play with my own sexuality in other ways. And like, to me, these were kind of ridiculous, you know, like it was like hypersexualized versions of women. And I didn't always know what I was saying, but in my I was following my intuition. And so then this was a piece that was in the Queer Style show that just closed at FIT, like the real kind of hybrid butch femme character. But then also hints of goth, right? And this fiber that, or the material Jenny was showing, the reflective material, like, you know, again, this illumination, this vulnerability, complete exposure versus complete concealment, but illumination. So, and then I start to move into now, which is like non-gender specific, right? Which is a very different place than I used to be with my fashion work. Which brings me to my performance work, which I'm gonna go quickly to the next slideshow because we don't have much time. I segued from the fashion work into art projects once I started teaching because I was able to make art. There wasn't pressure on me to make the same kind of There wasn't pressure on me to make a living through my art because I was teaching and had a salary, so I could start doing really experimental stuff. And I was working with groups of people, so I started doing these knitting performances. This is the piece that's up at Leslie Lohman right now. The show comes down next weekend, so I urge you to go see it. It's a great show. This is my piece. So this is a messy, blobby piece that is the accumulated material from 9 years of my Knitting Nation project, which is a site-specific installation project which deals with labor and humans' relationship to machines, and large-scale site-specific textile pieces that are crafted on site as kind of durational performances with a team of uniformed knitters, including myself. So I'm just going to show some images of the most recent projects from the past couple of years. This is at the Tang Museum. That's Solowit's piece in the background, which was really a mind-blowing thing for me because the whole thing that inspired this work was one of Solowit's wall drawings, the one with the snap lines, because I started seeing my Knitting Nation project not so much as a commentary on labor solely and a kind of activist thing about iconic textile things, but more of a 3D plotting machine, plotting lines and color and mass in space. So the knitting machines were the people in the knitting machines were the tool to kind of engage with space in a very large three-dimensional way. So here we have the ICA Boston piece called Darkness Descends, which still connects very much to my visceral emotional experiences in an abstract way with the bleeding heart and the big pile of messy redness, which was my heart at that time. And then these other ideas about, you know, fascism and military and geometry and performance and drama, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other iteration of Knitting Nation at ICA Boston was the complete opposite, with the shades up in the same space. Very playful, kind of Willy Wonka, textile factory, kind of Dr. Seussian landscape of what production looks like. And then this is the most recent piece that was at Occidental College in LA, which was, the theme was water. They were doing a big water initiative at the college, and they brought me in to do a workshop with the students over 2 weeks. And so the students actually learned to run the knitting machines, and they performed in this piece, and we made this huge cascade of fabric that looked like a river. So here's me at my, most playful queer self, being the sock monkey that I always wanted to be through my knitting, and as a kind of homage in some ways to Lee Bowery, one of my idols, who is an artist and performer who died very young of AIDS, and was a very important and influential figure to contemporary artists and designers the world over. So I think my time is up. I could show you many more images, but I won't, so thank you.
Okay, so I'll make a start. That was great. Thanks so much. So much to say, but wonderful presentations. I wanted just to begin to actually, last night Susan was talking about bona fides for being places, and my bona fide for being Susan inviting me today is actually the fact that I contributed to a book which she also was as part of, which was published in 2005, which celebrated a fabulous exhibition we had here at Parsons of the work of women designers, and the book's called Dish, still around, Narratives of Design and Gender. And it was really, I'm really pleased to be here, and pleased that Susan invited me on the basis of certainly that work. And just to think about today, I actually went back to that book and the essay I wrote, the short essay, just to look at really what I was saying then relative to Jenny's work and to Liz's work. And one of the fundamental questions for that essay was, do women design differently? Obviously differently from men. And as a part of answering that, I came up with some characteristics that I saw in the work, and there was quite extensive work of women designers in that show. And these characteristics included designs that addressed exclusively female experiences, the domestic sphere, design created for the home, design drawing on the everyday, the mundane and the ordinary, design that referenced social responsibilities for others, for well-being, for health, design that was collaborative in conception, production, and use, and design which also referenced technology, but not forefronted it, but as a kind of anonymous presence. So I was thinking about those, and I think we, sort of 10 years on, we can absolutely see those characteristics differently in the work we've seen this morning. But I was also thinking about what, if you like, pulls together Jenny and Liz's work for us. And certainly, I mean, one metaphor, but one reality is thread, and this sense of the thread, and also working in the public space. I was also thinking, when I was thinking about thread, about the wonderful show about 18 months ago at the Park Avenue Armory of the work of Anne Hamilton, which was using thread but based on swings. And thinking about also then the thread taking us back to the arc of this conference of narratives, and taking us back to, of course, women and weaving and Greek mythology, arguably the foundation of Western culture. And thinking about the myth of Penelope spinning to keep away her suitors. This was a sort of defense. But also thinking about the myth of Athena and Arachne, and you probably know these stories. But if you don't, briefly, Athena and Arachne, Athena being the goddess of craft, had this competition, Arachne being this young upstart, where Arachne was purporting to weave as well as Athena. And they were competing by weaving tapestries depicting the gods, of course, and Athena's was a very respectful portrayal of the gods, and Arachne's was a little bit more disrespectful. Anyway, the corollary was that Arachne didn't quite make it. She ran off and hung herself, and Athena saved her by turning her into, of course, the spider who is, is allowed to continue to spin, to weave, but can never get out of the spider web. So I was just thinking about kind of the thread, but those metaphors that we still really have in Western culture, which kind of, tie women in textiles in particular conceptual ways, which are, I think, also related to the sort of gendering of textiles, the conceptual gendering of textiles. That said, going back to what Liz was just saying, big question for this conference, does gender still matter? Does gender really still matter in design? Susan was saying last night, yes, it does. And Liz was talking about, her transgender garments, but also now, we're at a moment in time where a lot of younger people particularly are declaring themselves as transgender. So does gender really matter? That said, thinking about the logical kind of extension of thread into cloth, into clothing, and clothing in the commodity sphere, you try and go and buy a garment in any store anywhere that is not gendered. We have the Men's Warehouse, we have Eileen Fisher, obviously for women, and even Uniqlo has its male and female sections. So obviously we've got this huge trajectory of design from, much more conceptual ideas we've been introduced to this morning, making, but then also design in the commodity sphere. And along the way, particularly when we're talking about textiles, but not exclusively, we have these blips, we have these inconsistencies, which are to do with gendering, but also to do with, the way we actually think about gender and address gender in our culture today. So that's my trying to kind of pull the threads together. And narratives, of course, and narratives of gender.
Do we just start commenting?
Whatever.
I mean, I just want to add to what you're saying, Hazel, about the gendering, that it starts so early, because I have a young child, and to go to the stores and try to find any kind of, unisex clothing for kids is crazy. So it's like from the very beginning, there's gender happening in culture in terms of dress. Yeah.
And I want to pick up on that because this is my second stop today. My first stop was at 7 a.m. at Scarsdale Middle School up in Westchester County, where my daughter is participating in something called the Science Olympiad. And I was saying to Liz, I was actually saying to Jenny right before we started that I walked into a room with her, which was maybe 20% female. And this had just reinforced the experience that we had been having all the way through school with math and science, where it's as if the second feminist wave had never happened, and the girls just start dropping off out of the picture. And so I was saying how impressive it is, how interesting to find that actually both of you in many ways are straddling these kinds of very old-fashioned, but seemingly still with us, gender divisions. And I'm curious about your choices of material and the way in which that you interact with them. That is, how gendered did it feel to start working in the fiber arts? Did that, even as you started to make larger career decisions, did it feel like something that was a feminized field to be going into? I'm curious to go one step further with this question of technology. And as Jenny and I were talking, we were speaking of architecture, which is still dominated, I have discovered, I feel, by men, especially as you get higher and higher up in the field. Fashion, I'm not sure whether that, there too, there have actually been some odd kinds of mingling of these issues. So I would actually I would like to look to Jenny and then to Liz too.
Well, my initial interest in engaging textiles, primarily weaving, I don't know if this is on, had a lot to do with an interest in understanding how geometry and matter are computed. And so it wasn't, for me, a question of gender actually at all. It was really a very deep interest in the context of generative design, which has been an interest of mine for a number of years now within my expertise, which is computational design. there's a sort of niche area within architecture which tends to be heavily male-dominated, I think because of the sort of technological import of it, which came out of a lot of the early work that I talked about. So this interest in emergence, in generative design, and bottom-up processes, starting with simple rules, simple parts that through iteration over time produce much more complex results, led me to an interest in textiles, because one could say that knitting is the first example of 3D printing. And the whole story around computing coming from material, the organization of information through the punch card, that just absolutely blew my mind early on as a kind of point of departure. So that's how I came to textiles, as an incredible model to begin to look at how we could shorten the gap between digital design production and material manifestation. And in architecture right now, there's a huge paradigm shift happening in the way that we make and fabricate. The ability to produce complex form, not so new, but the ability to rationalize it and produce non-standard components, et cetera, is changing our built environment. It's changing issues of representation, plan, section. All of the modes of communicating how one builds is shifting. And for me, textiles has been an amazing model to explore in that context. And so the question of gender has come up through that pursuit. So.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like the textiles, kind of why that, I come from a family that was, first of all, very kind of DIY, like make things with what you have. So my mother taught me to sew when I was really young, and she was into all kinds of things, like whatever crafts were of the moment. I was learning them from a very young age. And my father used to make sails for his sailboat. Like, he would make the spinnakers, and so he had an industrial sewing machine. So I would watch him make these huge pieces. And my grandmother was also someone, I said she wanted to be an architect, but she was also a very kind of DIY person who made all kinds of things. And so textiles and clothing, making those things was really kind of built in to my identity from a very young age, from both, sides. I think, and it also came from a place of pragmatism, again, this kind of economical, like, oh, why buy it if you can make it? Real DIY stuff. So less gendered and more kind of the Puritan work ethic, kind of get stuff done. But I think as far as the fashion industry, the textile industry, and like male-dominated industries, et cetera, I mean, most industries are dominated by men, aren't they? I don't know. I think that's a huge generalization. But on the other hand, I find that through working in design education, art and design education, and watching the student demographic and the gender balance in both fashion and textile departments for years, there are always tons of women in both of those disciplines, but often the men get special treatment because they're the unique minorities in the departments, and they rise to the top faster for different reasons. And I'm not bitter about it. It's just a reality. Like, I think that those fields, like the people who get the most attention on the outside are the men, like the ones who may be seen as the most successful. However, it bears note that in fashion, at least, I know very well that behind the scenes are many, many women, like at Donna Karan, at Ralph Lauren, at all of the big labels. The people who are really running the show there and doing the hard work are probably, there's a higher percentage of women designers in that component of the industry. They're the ones that, there are a lot of them are less hungry for the I'm the top, I'm in charge, but I'm the one who's really going to get things done again, it's extreme generalization, but I see it a lot in like great designers who are working behind the scenes. Yeah. I mean, that's it. I think it's interesting.
Oops, is this on? Okay. I have a question about that. I want to take gender out to a more meta perspective. When I think about your work, Jenny, and to some extent, although there are different arenas, the spatial dimension of your work, Liz, and the knitting project, your Knitting Nation. I am left in the position that Peter pointed out last night of looking at what is left over. So, in other words, the product. I'm not looking at the process. You give us insights into the process. So, even though this is a fairly conventional, or you could say art historical perspective of looking at the work and not at the process, I'm reminded that it seems to me this work fits in more with the traditions of, say, Gothic fan vaulting or the Alhambra. If you've ever been to the Alhambra and been in those stalactite spaces, they are very different from sort of normal Euclidean spaces. And the East has always been gendered feminine. The organic stylistically is gendered feminine. Is it possible, or is it even useful to say that when I look at your collaborators, many of whom are men, and I look at where architecture is going, that there is an introduction of a feminine, well, let's say aesthetic. I don't mean aesthetic by look, but a sort of an approach that has been gendered feminine. Not that this is girls' work, but that this is something that's been considered secondary, and that this form language, this organic form language, for lack of a better word, is different, significantly different from an architecture of compression and thrust. And in that sense, might we consider the work you're doing and the men you're doing with it, doing work that is gendered more to the feminine?
That's a big question. But yes, I think you're onto something that's pretty huge and pretty exciting. I mean, one could perhaps say that the whole project of emergence in architecture in the context of generative design is very much at root of a more feminine, and in the context of gender, architectural pursuit. And I mean, some of my heroes in architecture, Gaudi, looking at his process, and he was very interested in how matter is computed, and the parametric analog models he produced to engage scale and understand how those non-standard complex forms could actually be built is incredible. And I guarantee you, if he was alive today, he'd be at the forefront of engaging these technologies for making in architecture. But yes, there's a huge shift away from the Cartesian and the orthogonal to one that is about lightness and organicism and expanse, woven geometries, knitted geometries, and it's precisely because we now have the ability to shorten that gap between the production of a design and how it's made. I mean, the notion of the architect, the napkin sketch partie that you then design towards is, sure, that still happens, but it's shifting because now one can develop an architectural design where the diagram is emergent and always changing. And that goes back to my interest in textiles, because that's always been a part of how the two weak strands coming together to form a robust entity. So the possibility to design through relationships then in turn allows for one to look at more organic structures. I mean, the extracellular matrix as a ground is, for me, the kind of next step in terms of understanding how that as a fine-scale design ecology can impact architecture. But it's an incredible model. I mean, we're heading in that direction. So I think it's a really, really important point that you've made. I'm not quite yet ready to to talk about it, but it's because I'm so enmeshed in it as a process. But I have to say this is the first symposium. I've been at six symposia in the last month and a half, but this is the first one where the table is all women, which I very much appreciate.
I think if your work in the immediacy, in the same sense that Jenny's talking about,
Yeah.
there was something about that, whether that's gendered or not, but it seems to me that's the link between the two of you, that and the body.
Mm-hmm. I think there's yeah, it's true, and different issues of scale, and then the modules. I wanted to point out one other thing that I was thinking about before regarding gender and the industries, which is in the textile, like the global textile industry of weavers to knitters to technicians to spinners, like everybody working in the global textile industry. I can't guess at the numbers of male versus female, but I suspect it's probably pretty even. In terms of like women's work or men's work, like there may be just as many men out there weaving and knitting as women when you look at like the industrial landscape globally. But I have noticed like in factories, like, the men are the ones who do the programming of the industrial knitting machines. You never see a woman programmer, but in the US there are plenty of them, and in Europe there are plenty of them. So I don't know if the textile industry on the labor aspect, that in that sector is as gendered as one might think, from low to high tech.
But as you were saying before, the question is where the power lies. That's the politics.
Well, yeah, I already agree where it lies. Men.
Yeah, Liz, you made me think of, I think it's Audrey Flack. She's in her 80s. Started out as a painter with the big boys, then went to sculpture. Oh, my God. And then from there, God forbid, to installation. I mean, career suicide, if you want to go in terms of the art world's opinions. Always had the teaching, which I think is propping you up also. You went from, building up into high couture, into art, into installation art, though you have the teaching. Just as a general idea of a certain kind of way you don't want to move, because you reach the peak with the couture, I guess, as a layman, I would say. Do you ever think about that?
What, that I'm committing
Careerist
suicide?
Well, no, just careerist notions of where one would want to be along the artistic, creative front. And then the reality of what the opinions go, what you've chosen.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think of it probably like most artists and designers do, like on an ongoing basis, because I want to survive doing what I love. So I've taken big steps to do that. And I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm making a lot of art now, which is very rewarding to me, and I didn't have time to show it in my slideshow, like the current work I'm doing, which bridges interior textiles, installation work, and surface pattern and painting. So there's a whole new body of work emerging for me that in some ways, again, like I love that word pragmatic, like there's always part of me that's thinking, how am I gonna make money doing this? And so the work that I'm doing now, like the paintings, which I haven't painted in years and I love it so much. I'm doing a lot of painting. I just got back from a month in Peru, like on my kind of self-imposed residency of just painting 2D work and thinking about like, okay, well, I'm going to take this painting and have a rug made, and this painting and have blankets made. So there's always a balance between the practical and the sheerly expressive artist part. So it feels actually the opposite of career suicide to me. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I have a little question for Liz Clark, a slightly different. I think you mentioned that you have 2 young children, and that you had, or one, and that you have trouble getting a unisex or non-sexist clothing. So I just thought, since you have your background, do you ever think about creating them yourself
Of
or a little bit?
course. Yeah, I don't have trouble finding unisex clothing. I just am annoyed when I go into stores and it's like the girls section and the boys section. I was just pointing out that culturally we start very early, like with babies, like pink or blue. But as a consumer, I don't shop that way. I go for whatever I like. So, but sure, I make kids sweaters sometimes, but it's not part of my commerce model right now. It's emerging.
I have another question, simply because I teach fashion as well, and it's very related to what I discuss with my students. When we look at the material qualities of fabric, there are some inherently masculine fabrics and some inherently feminine fabrics. And those relate to very sort of gender normative garments. And as women, we have, for a while already, tried to renegotiate these sort of gender differences. But even when we look around the room today, I think there are more women wearing untraditional garments, or perhaps there's a greater variety of looks worn by women than there is by men. So just to ask perhaps a difficult question, what do you think exactly is men's role in renegotiating a gender balance, not only in the fashion industry, but anywhere?
Hazel, you want to answer that as our fashion theorist?
I think part of it is letting go of power or looking at other power models. I mean, it was interesting when Jenny was talking about, the way she was designing, and even Liz, this, in the sense maybe of the feminine of designing from the kind of inside out, which is also part of kind of moving out of the modernist moment. We're able to do that. But, I mean, it is to do with recognizing other models. And, I mean, for me, one of the models I really welcome working with women but also men is collaboration. And I noticed that in this institution we're part of here, that one goes into meetings, for example, and there is an implicit hierarchy which is not based on a collaborative model. So I think it is actually looking at other models of doing, and that doesn't mean that men can't do that and men are not willing to do that. But unfortunately, the institutionalization of our culture, it kind of makes certain things really, really embedded. So I think it's wonderful to get examples of women, men, too, people working at a much more kind of grassroots level. And as Jenny was saying, and the change comes from within. I mean, it's a cliche, but actually I think that's actually how it does happen.
I agree with you, but I think it's also, it is necessary for women and to, like I said, to collaborate, but I think we're doing that more as women, in a way, and perhaps even when we look at the young fashion students, they are just, when we look at fashion implicitly, there are more different kinds of gender ideals that are being expressed in fashion by young fashion students than there are actually worn outside. So perhaps I'm being a little bit impatient with this change, but I just wonder how we can sort of open up a negotiation between both genders without being, stereotypical about either gender.
I think showing examples helps, like Hazel was saying, looking at different models. I think that's the way. I mean, exposure has such an impact on young people, like learning what's out there and seeing different ways of thinking.
Let me just add that I think we are coming up to a break, and we'll have time for one more question.
This is not a question, but it's a comment, because I kind of appreciate the last part of of this conversation. I do think that there is something about that brings in an incredibly important way the issues of design, or the field, or the dimension of design, social in society, and the dimension of gender. And I think women have to be strategic. That's the difference when you are asking about the balance question, right? And listening to what you were saying about your own, Jenny, fashion trajectory, that doesn't necessarily have to be really realized. So we are not always aware of how strategic we have to be in order to make it. And I think there is something to learn from design. in that, and so to bring those two things together is very, very, those two dimensions of our life, is very important. Anyway, strategic.
Well, just in closing, then, well, go right ahead. Okay, so one more quick question.
Okay, sorry. I was just thinking about this notion of gender in twofold, and I just wanted your thoughts on it. So when we speak about gender, we're talking, I think, predominantly right now about like the ideological components of gender versus like the biological components of gender. And I wonder how that plays a role in, you know, like your point about changing ideology, because biology is what it is, and how that plays a role in, you know, crafting new stories, new narratives, or even how it plays a role in your work, you know, with this idea of the physical form versus the cultural understanding of what male and female gender dynamics are.
I don't think I really understand what you mean.
So, well, basically, you know, when we're talking about clothes, like fitting the body, and this notion of like unisex clothing, the body, you know, you have male and female bodies, but you know, not necessarily, there's no need for a pink versus blue, right? And that's a very sort of subtle way, but you know, there are more things that we go into in terms of how we begin to, especially in fashion, you know, decide what is male versus what is female. But then the body is still, I think they're two different bodies physically, right, in a biological sense. And I just wonder if that plays a role in thinking about fashion, thinking about design, and thinking about gender.
But now we're in a period where it's not always two different bodies, and gender has become much more fluid. So we have to kind of reframe our ideas of what body is and what gender is. And as trans people become more and more part of our everyday landscape, and people get more comfortable with that idea that gender can be fluid, I think there's a real paradigm shift there about, you know, we just all want clothes that fit and feel good. So, I mean, I know plenty of people who are trans or gender fluid who really struggle with figuring out what they're going to wear, you know, and so then we have places like Uniqlo, which really kind of address that for the person who's not as interested in being gendered in their clothing presentation.
In closing, I want to go back to my opening remarks as well. I'm taken aback to hear that there was a discussion yesterday that gender is no longer of importance, when in fact I've just been spending the last week with some of the 20,000 people who've come to the United Nations to discuss not just gender, but the inequalities between gender, and exactly with this question of how to push forward. I don't come to this table, however, suggesting that it's hopeless. Indeed, it's something quite interesting is going on, and it's not us in this room per se, but this is really a more global phenomenon, which perhaps is getting kind of clouded in our discussion here, because there is a great deal going on out there dealing with gender and bringing together people to talk exactly about these issues, but to do so through various means that actually have global import. And these are discussions that take place all around us, but it's not just really in the academy where they exist. So I'm going to close with that idea, and we can pick up more broadly with the bigger themes within this conference.
Thank you, all of you. Let's see. Okay. As a segue, I'm going to ask, thank you for your service. And move, I mean, if we're talking about, I mean, one of the reasons why gender comes up is one's agency limited if one is gendered feminine? I made the argument last night that while in an ideal world, gender would go away. I mean, the dualities would go away, and we would just be content with the notions of gendered and shades of gender. Very rarely do we discuss the subject without talking about the masculine gender or the feminine gender, and they have different associations and different capacities with them. and they have to do with agency, which is the subject of our next panel.